Audio Jungle.
Bear with me for a moment as I explain the Paris climate deal cobbled together by kleptocrats, dictators, and the Obama administration. It's a treaty committing the world's governments to decisive action, supposedly against climate change. It's also not a treaty so that President Obama could bind the United States to it with the stroke of his pen. It's binding on the new president because it's a treaty, although it's not. It's the law of the land because the U.S. Senate somehow approved it without ever actually voting on it. That's because it's merely an extension of an old treaty that the Senate ratified specifically on the ground that it couldn't be thus extended. The decisive action promised in the treaty that is not a treaty consists of governments, most of them run by dictators and thieves, promising on an honor system to take steps of their own choosing, including steps that are impossible, to change future weather patterns, on penalty of no punishment if they break their word. But if you're not for the Paris Treaty, well, you just don't care about the fate of the planet. Got it? Okay, here's some background. As you may know, experts have sounded the alert about climate change. In the 1890s, the fear was a new ice age. In the 1930s, it was warming. In the early 1960s, it was cooling. Then in 1969, experts warned the White House about the warming that was going to put New York and Washington underwater by the year 2000. In 2008, ABC News had New York underwater by 2015. So to fight the threat of global warming, politicians and bureaucrats gathered at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. President Bush, the first one, had run for president promising to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. So he submitted the Rio Treaty to the U.S. Senate. Senators ratified it in October 1992 on a voice vote with no debate. The treaty wasn't controversial because it was a treaty to get together and make more treaties. It had no effect on its own. 5 years later, when a climate treaty was negotiated at a meeting in Kyoto, Senators Robert Byrd and Chuck Hagel introduced a resolution that said the Senate would not accept any global warming treaty that put all the real burden on so-called developed countries, or that would result in serious economic harm in the U.S. And of course, any treaty would have to be approved by a 2/3 vote of senators, as is true for all treaties. This Byrd-Hagel resolution was specifically aimed at the Kyoto Agreement, and it passed 95 to nothing. Flash forward to 2015. The Obama administration teamed up with the Communist Chinese, the worst human rights violators and the worst environmental criminals in the world, to negotiate a treaty in Paris. The Chinese agreed to do nothing other than the things they'd already been projected to do. The U.S., on the other hand, would have massive cuts in the emissions that supposedly cause global warming. The Chinese and the Obama administration pressured the rest of the world to sign on. The effort was helped by the promise of $100 billion a year in transfers from the economically successful countries to the so-called developing countries, or at least to the ruling classes in those countries. Negotiations in Paris were completed on December 12, 2015. The United Nations Secretary General announced on October 5, 2016, that the agreement had met the threshold and would take effect November 4th. Get it? The treaty had to be okayed before November 8th, because that's when the American people would have their say in the election. Supporters of the treaty declared it to be both Congress-proof and Trump-proof. If you've been listening carefully, you see the problem. The United States cannot be a party to a treaty unless the Senate votes to approve it by a 2/3 vote, and there's been no vote. So, President Obama simply declared it to be ratified. Meanwhile, all those other countries that signed on, they get to decide how much they're cutting, and unlike us, they're on the honor system to keep their promises. And if they do follow through, when so-called energy efficiency measures are included, the cost to the world could be $16.5 trillion by 2030. Those numbers represent spending on global warming that is greater than the combined income of the world's billion poorest people. To sum up, this is what passes for logic in the so-called international community. The idea that the world's governments will cut off their countries' access to affordable energy and modern technology and otherwise impoverish their people. Racing against the clock, trying to lock down a deal before the American people could have their say in the 2016 election, the Obama administration, the Chinese, and gaggles of dictators and kleptocrats delivered unto the world the Paris Climate Treaty, which, luckily for us, also isn't a treaty. It would be funny if it weren't so serious. There are several ways the Trump administration can get out of this mess, including by withdrawing from that Rio Treaty of 1992. So we'll see who has the last laugh. If you liked this video, please give us a thumbs up below and hit the links on your right to read the full story on our website and subscribe to our channel. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.